On behalf of USAID and ResilienceLinks, I welcome you to Connecting Through Crises, Opportunities and Challenges in Strengthening Informal Support Networks. I'm Sophie Fontaine with ResilienceLinks. Before we begin, let me orient you to the BlueJeans platform. On the right side of the screen, you'll see most of your controls. First, if you haven't done so already, please use the chat to introduce yourself. To ask questions throughout the webinar, use the Q&A button on the bottom right. If the presentation is too small on your screen, you can use the slide bar at the bottom of the window to adjust your view. Lastly, we are recording this webinar and will email you the post-event resources shortly following the event. Next slide, please. You can now see our agenda for today on your screen. Following this brief introduction, Michael Coons, a Senior Knowledge Management Advisor at USAID's Center for Resilience, will share some opening remarks. Then, Maha El-Samahi, a Resilience Research and Learning Advisor at Mercy Corps, will provide a technical presentation on the role of informal support networks during crises. Following Maha's presentation, Samantha Levine-Finley will moderate a panel featuring Guhad Adan, an independent development and humanitarian consultant, and Jesse Anderson, a Senior Conflict Advisor at USAID's Center for Resilience. Finally, we've also reserved plenty of time for an open Q&A session with Maha, Guhad, and Jesse. As a reminder, please share your questions for our speakers using the Q&A button on the bottom right. If possible, please indicate who your question is for. Thank you for your attendance today. I'll now pass it to Michael.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks to the entire Resilience team for organizing this webinar. That's the role of locally led support networks. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see such an impressive crowd today. I'd like to start out by saying that on behalf of the Center for Resilience, I really appreciate this discussion forum that ResilienceLinks. Monthly newsletters and resilience themes are a great way to share knowledge, learn about the growing community of practitioners, their work designing and implementing programs to strengthen resilience among households, communities, and some of you may be familiar with USAID's resilience policy, which underscores the importance of developing local capacities of people. The idea here is to help people help themselves by anticipating and mitigating shocks and stresses with locally led systems and networks that are essential to escape stay out of poverty. We're looking forward to today's discussion, and we appreciate the opportunity to learn about the growing body of evidence demonstrating that strengthened capacity of locally led support networks is essential to achieve and maintain well-being outcomes in the face of conflict, COVID, climate, and other significant shocks. Thank you to all our speakers and everybody who helped make this webinar possible. And thanks again to everyone for joining today. I'll now hand it over to Maha El-Samahi. Thanks, Maha, and over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you're joining us from. My name is Maha El-Samahi, and I am a Research and Learning Advisor with Mercy Corps, where I support our resilience research portfolio. And to kick off today's discussion, I'm going to talk us through some of the research detailing the role informal support networks play in household resilience during protracted crises, drawing in particular from Mercy Corps' research on this topic. This research has been co-led by my colleagues Jian Kim, Alex Humphrey, and Vi Krishnan at Mercy Corps, as well as colleagues from the Feinstein Center at Tufts University. It was also generously funded by USAID's Center for Resilience, OFDA, and the Real Award. So we're drawing from a really rather large and rich body of evidence that cuts across a wide variety of contexts, including, but not limited to, Somalia, South Sudan, and most recently, our research in Yemen. And for those of you in the audience who joined us on a webinar back in February, where we presented our research in Yemen, some of these topics might sound familiar. And for those of you who are interested, we can share a link to that recording, which explored the Yemeni context in greater detail. So whether it's a sudden onset shock, like an earthquake, or a protracted conflict entering its 10th year, the evidence underscores the outsized role that informal support networks play in communities coping during and after crisis. In protracted crises, informal support networks allow households to leverage their connections to access resources to help meet their immediate needs and offset the negative impacts of conflict and crisis. These networks often distribute and redistribute various tangible and intangible resources, including safe passage and refuge, food, emotional support, and remittances. But despite the critical role they play, aid actors have paid little attention to the ways in which external assistance can strengthen or even undermine informal support networks. And as a bit of framing, before we kind of dive into the meat of the presentation, I'll talk us through 3 lessons that we highlighted in our recently released synthesis by Mercy Corps' research on this topic. Along with each lesson, I'll provide accompanying recommendations and supporting evidence. And while these by no means are the only recommendations to come out of this research, they are, we feel, critical lessons for helping aid actors develop and implement programming that accounts for these crucial sources of resilience. So lesson 1, measuring informal support networks as a key outcome and early warning indicator. First, as a part of real-time and ongoing monitoring activities, aid actors should include questions on both households' social connections and the strength of their networks. In both South Sudan and Yemen, we saw evidence that sharing capacities were eroding after many years of conflict, and informal support networks were reaching their limits because of widespread resource depletion. Because the collapse of networks can be sudden, changes in the strength of informal support networks can indicate deteriorating humanitarian conditions, allowing aid actors to act before these networks reach a point of exhaustion. In turn, aid actors must also measure the effect of external assistance on informal support networks. So we found that households were making difficult decisions regarding their limited resources. In South Sudan, many households, even in periods of extreme food insecurity, were sharing with others even if it came at the expense of their current food security. In interviews, they highlighted that this helped them maintain relationships that they know they could turn to for support in the future. Aid actors can leverage existing assessments and evaluations, such as conflict, gender, or genoharm analyses, to better understand households' decision-making processes, and also understand how external assistance may be impacting informal networks. This is really an important opportunity for aid actors to begin thinking about resilience in the longer term, recognizing that households use their assistance beyond immediate consumption needs to protect their longer-term well-being. This takes us to our second lesson, which concerns designing, targeting, and community engagement strategies. So when aid actors designed programs without informal support networks in mind, they unintentionally fueled social tensions and exacerbated social exclusion, weakening and undermining informal support networks. We recommend several ways to mitigate this. First, increasing support for community committees while also helping them remain accountable. So aid actors relied on community committees and local leaders to help with the targeting and distribution processes. But our research in Yemen found that these local actors were often navigating significant amounts of pressure from both local political elites as well as the accountability standards they were held to by INGOs. Nonetheless, these community committees are a vital entry point for aid actors to ensure that local priorities are reflected in various aspects of their humanitarian response. Along with maintaining accountability standards, aid actors can gradually allocate more decision-making power to community committees while also scaling up support to them. For example, this support can take the form of conflict resolution and community mediation trainings. In turn, aid actors must work towards community-driven approaches to targeting. Our research identified several challenges regarding communication, including the failure to communicate effectively about the aid itself, as well as how households were allowed to use assistance. So in South Sudan, Mercy Corps found that there was a lack of understanding regarding selection processes or even what assistance entailed. People in the community heard that some were receiving cash, but never received any communication about what it was intended for, amounts, or how recipients were selected. This led to the perception that cash recipients received more cash than they actually did, leading to members seeing them as being better off in the long term, even though it was a short-term assistance program. Eventually, this led to them being excluded from their support networks, and when the effects of the cash distribution eventually had worn off, recipient households then struggled to receive support from their networks. Second, when it came to how to use assistance, in Yemen and South Sudan, there was the perception, whether accurate or not, that sharing assistance was not allowed. But our conversations with aid actors underscored that was not in fact the case. Perceptions regarding the permissibility of sharing ultimately escalated tensions and exacerbated pressures on community committees and local community actors who are overseeing the distribution. With these challenges in mind, aid actors need to ensure that messaging regarding vulnerability aligns with local definitions of need. This can include erecting clear signage in high-trafficked areas about selection criteria, posting drop-in hours, and investing more overall in community accountability mechanisms. And then finally, seeking out and investing in opportunities to partner with informal support efforts. I think perhaps one of the most critical takeaways from this research is that these informal networks are faster to mobilize, they're more efficient, and they're better able to reach hard-to-access areas. Bearing this in mind, aid actors should identify and support existing informal initiatives. In our research, we found a number of examples where communities spontaneously organized to meet challenges head-on. In Yemen, for example, neighborhoods established community kitchens that cooked and distributed meals to vulnerable households, which were identified by other community members and local leaders. Second, aid actors should look to disseminate early warning information through informal support networks. These networks facilitated the spread of timely, accurate, and life-saving information. In South Sudan, socially isolated groups were the last to receive information about incoming conflict and spreading insecurity. They were often the last to flee, they were more likely to be separated from family members, and they had less access to material resources during displacement. Aid actors can leverage informal support networks to disseminate early warning info locally, paying particular attention to socially isolated groups. Potential partners in this endeavor can include religious leaders, women and youth-led groups, early warning committees, and local traders who have all served as excellent conduits for information in the past. So that's it for my presentation. I'm going to pass it off to Samantha, who will begin the panel and lead a very interesting and stimulating discussion.
Thanks, Maha. Hello, everyone. My name is Samantha Levine-Finley, and I'm really glad to be with you here today. So we're going to start with a question for Dr. Jessie Anderson. And Jessie, here's your question. From your perspective, why are social connections and informal social protection networks so important?
Samantha, thanks. I think it's striking. Basically, all of the data we've collected coming from the Center for Resilience over basically the past decade points to how these social sources of resilience really matter most for folks. So for instance, the 2018 Resilience Evidence Forum report that we put together, social capital is one of the key sources of resilience that transcends context. It then pops up in every single survey we've done since, and that's in a range of contexts, from more stable places to protracted crises. We know in protracted crises that government formal support is often weak to non-existent, and people are relying on these informal social networks to get by. And I think also just kind of in a more informal way, we know people survive largely up to their own up to themselves and the people around them. Even while we're coming in with assistance, we being the donor community, the evidence bears out, and I think we anecdotally know that people's social support during crisis is everything, and that people are largely getting by up to their own energy and agency. And so, I think that is just so clear. I think we're at a point in the conversation where it's just so obvious that this is the most important thing in the world for people's resilience during crisis. But then the next question, I know we'll get to this, is okay, and then how exactly does this work in a nitty-gritty way? With and through these informal social support networks in a healthy, meaningful way that leads to more impactful assistance. And Maha gave us some ideas for that, and I know that's where the conversation will go. But anyway, yeah, those are just some thoughts from me, and over to Guhad.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'd like to introduce Guhad Adan, an independent development and humanitarian consultant. Guhad, same question for you. From your perspective, why are social connections and informal social protection networks so important?
Thank you very much, all the participants and the other teams. And informal social protection is an important component of social protection, especially in rural communities and in some societies where the main structure is more of a kinship system than maybe the developed world where the government is responsible of everybody. But in a situation where, for example, like Somalia or in the Horn of Africa, where the main structure of or the main sources of social protection, the main sources of physical protection, social protection, and connections are through the societal system, then this informal social protection becomes very important. And it is very important mainly because it is the first source of response when it comes to crisis. Take the current crisis in the Horn of Africa. The informal social protection system started working mid last year, and it is working until now, while the conventional humanitarian actors, the conventional donors and the like are still struggling to mobilize resources and respond to the crisis. Were it not the social capital or the informal social protection, then we will have realized, or we will have seen large number of people being drawn into the crisis, and the death toll will have been more than as it is now. So social capital are important source of humanitarian assistance and resilience building in this part of the world, where the main system is societal or kinship system. In Somalia, for example, any family or any household that has a family member who has urban job or business or in the diaspora is capable of managing the humanitarian crisis better than those who don't, because they have people whom they can lean on, or people, something we have been calling in the last 8 years in our researches, people to cry to, somebody that you can cry to when you have crisis, or you can lean on the same person when you have crisis, than those who don't have. It is also important because of the societal structure, which is based on kinship, blood, and marital relationship, geographical relationship, among others, are the source of the connection in terms of the informal, in terms of the informal social protection. The blood means then the blood relationship. Marital means then you are married from a family, then that family, in case of a problem, will help you or you will help them. Geographical means then maybe if you are, for example, from a certain region, all those from those regions in the diaspora or in other places might come together, raise resources, and respond to the crisis. It is the only available support during the early part of the crisis before the conventional humanitarian actors come into play. For example, in Somalia and many parts of the Horn. In such a case, then it is very important, and were it not, then a lot will have died before the conventional aid will have come. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Guhad, for that really terrific and comprehensive answer. We're actually going to stay with you for an additional question. When aid actors don't design targeting and community engagement strategies with social connections in mind, they can unintentionally disrupt informal social protection networks. What are examples of things aid actors can proactively do to engage informal community actors?
Well, the first thing that they can do is that aid actors, when they come, the first thing that they should know that people expect a lot, and the first thing is that they should manage expectation. Without managing expectation, then they are likely to cause more harm than good. And for them to understand where the local or the informal social protection networks, then it is important to understand the dynamics, the profile of the area of operation. Of course, during crisis, it will be very difficult to do some nitty-gritties of profiling of the area, because it will delay and increase the bureaucracies, which of course is not good for responding to crisis. But I will say the first thing is to understand that, those who are, for example, in any place where there is crisis, there is a societal structure. If there is a government, even within the government, there are structures which are tribal structures, clan-based structures, and then sub-clans, lineages, and the like. And in such a case, then they are dominant clans or dominant tribes who have the social capital more than the minorities or the marginalized communities. So it is also important to understand those nitty-gritties of the area of oppression. And it is also important, one of the other things that they should do is that working directly with the people through their leaders. The leaders means the community leaders, as Maha has been referring to in her presentations. So working with the community leaders or working with the community themselves directly through their leaders to understand the dynamics of who has the informal social protection and who don't. Maybe sometimes it might be a bit difficult to read the thin line between the two, but it is also important between, for example, the dominant clans are likely to have, or the dominant tribes are likely to have more protection, more informal social protection, purposely because they are in the local authorities, those who are working for aid actors, the business community, and maybe have more diaspora connection than the others. So it is also important to understand that one. The other thing is that one of the other things that the aid actors should do so that they don't disrupt the informal system is give chance to the local knowledge. It's important to understand, to learn from the local community or how they are doing and what they are doing. By that, then it will give you the chance maybe to understand where the gaps are and fill into those gaps. Then the other point is that understanding the local dynamics. Of course, part of it I said earlier is the dominant and the minority groups for better inclusivity. And then with that one again, it is also important to have the feedback mechanism, not generalizing it, but also making sure that within the feedback mechanism, you also have room for those who are not capable of, or those who are on the peripheries of the aid. When I say the peripheries of aid, are those who are either minorities or marginalized, who are not at the front during the crisis and are likely to suffer more than the others. Over.
Thank you very much. Well, that was really helpful in terms of what aid actors can do. If we look at it from the other perspective, what are people on the ground looking for in potential partnerships with external aid actors?
Good. As I said earlier, the people on the ground are very expecting a lot from the aid actors, and they expect supportive solutions with limited bureaucracies. For example, in Somalia, where I've been working for quite some time, and the social network or the informal social network, which is the main one being the diaspora support, it is The response of the diaspora network, the diaspora to crisis is very rapid, and I always call it is the right response, because it comes on time with less bureaucracy, and they want such a kind of responses. And what they expect from the external actors or the external aid actors: one, reduce the bureaucracy; two, work with the local institutions, empower the local actors, the local NGOs, TSOs, community institutions, the local institutions. What we have been seeing is that the contradicting narratives of the grand bargain, for example, of localization vis-a-vis international actors trying to localize themselves and overrunning the local actors. So that is causing more harm than good, and the barrier becomes wider and wider. And it is the easiest way to close that is maybe support the local institution. And my advice to the international actors is to empower the local actors and work with the local actors. Over.
Thank you so much. And there's already comments in the chat thanking you for these responses, Guhad. We really appreciate it. Next question is over to Jesse. Jesse, aid actors frequently rely on local community actors and committees when it comes to targeting and program coordination. But these local actors and committees often have to, of course, abide by standards and obligations from implementing agencies, as well as navigate significant pressure from local elites and authorities. So what are some steps that donors and aid actors can take to support informal community actors when they work with them during difficult and different stages of the program and implementation process?
Yeah, Samantha, thanks for the question. And I would say that Maha outlined some really great options. So I'm going to kind of editorialize and build on some of those. And I would say there's a mix of low-hanging fruit, and then sort of some mid-tier stuff, and then some thorny things that we know could matter for the direction of this work, but it might take some time. And on the low-hanging fruit side, I would say, just tracking informal social protection is the first piece to the puzzle. So we can't improve how we're responding if we still don't understand what's going on in this local context. And so I think, for instance, in the resilience space, we ask general questions in a survey with beneficiaries about different kinds of social capital or access to remittances, but that's about it. And these kinds of questions can become so much more nuanced, with like real-time monitoring, a lot more interest in the character of social relationships, what's going on there. And then similarly, kind of like baking questions like that into evaluation processes, into how do we, how are we doing monitoring throughout the life cycle of the program? I think things like that are just kind of like this first order, step to take. And, for instance, in a lot of our surveys, we ask so many detailed questions about all of the assets that folks have. And we don't do the same with social assets, even though we know they matter likely more than the physical assets someone has for their life opportunities or what's going to happen to them tomorrow. So that's just, to me, some super low-hanging fruit. Then I think there's that issue of, how can you just make sure that the criteria is super transparent? And I have two quick thoughts on this. One, I found that it was interesting. IPA, which is this organization that does a lot of randomized control trials, they do these trials where there's a treatment group that gets a benefit and then another group that doesn't. And you would think that would create tension or conflict because some people are getting this benefit, this program, and another group very explicitly knows that they're not. But actually, come to find out, there's so much dialogue and communication about why the one group was receiving it versus the other, that people were more okay with it. At least they knew transparently why they weren't receiving this benefit than a lot of these scenarios where it's just opaque. And I actually think when it comes to a resilience portfolio where we're ideally layering humanitarian and development assistance in the same geography, it's likely that we have even more of these challenges because there's probably different selection criteria, or there often is, across those different programs, and that can lead to a lot of confusion. I know this came up on a learning event in one of our focus countries where even though people liked the individual programs, there was tension and confusion about why one person was eligible for one and not the other, and just what was going on there. And we know that's so common, and Guhad speaks to this. So that kind of radical transparency and just over communicating on that front is another low-hanging fruit to me. Efficient. So for instance, one example that comes to mind is tensions between refugees or displaced populations and host communities. Being transparent about why displaced folks are receiving resources when the host community isn't will not resolve the tension between those groups. You know, it's the fact that one group is getting something while the other isn't is just part of that conflict. And in that case, ideally broad-based programming would be part of the answer. And then the final piece about how do we support these committees, you know, these committees are in a complicated position between local politics and partnering with NGOs and the donor community. And here is where I just strongly recommend, I'm a big fan of integrating conflict resolution and peace building elements across programming from a donor perspective. This is actually extremely inexpensive, and there's so many proven models about how this can be effective. So actually providing more structure and oversight and tools and skills for committees to be navigating this, to me, that's just one piece to the puzzle. And it's something we do in other kinds of interventions, and there's no reason why we can't bring that more commonly into these kinds of settings. And then finally, the idea of supporting local initiatives, and I think we'll get to this a bit later too, but I think that the momentum is there to be supporting these informal local initiatives, ideas, social movements that aren't necessarily an official NGO, right? And I think with the localization agenda, that is that's something that everyone is interested in. And then kind of like with just working with informal social networks in general, the question gets to the how. You know, what exactly does that look like? How do we do that better? But I think that the appetite and the willingness is there, and then just figuring out the how from a donor and international partner perspective is kind of what's next. So yeah, Samantha, back over to you, but those are just some thoughts for next steps.
Thank you very much. And I also just want to say there's really terrific questions coming in the Q&A. So please, everyone, you do keep them coming. The next question we're going to also have Jesse and Guhad respond to. Jesse, you'll go first. Over the past several years, donors and agencies have increasingly acknowledged that the sector needs to invest more in localized action and responses. It seems almost a given that these local networks are a prime opportunity to do just that. So the question is, what are some opportunities and challenges at the institutional level when it comes to partnering with and working through these informal community actors?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I'm going to refer back to a former life of mine for what I see as both an opportunity and a challenge. I wrote my dissertation and did my fieldwork on aid in Somalia. Guhad, I didn't share that with you, but I also looked at USAID records from like the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it's really interesting. USAID grants, you know, from the 80s only funded community groups and informal local initiatives. Donors were actually wired in the past to be funding these small social movements, informal groups, community-based structures that were not formal. And then in my opinion, it was really about this change we saw in the 90s and the 2000s to professionalize the sector and focus on formal NGOs that kind of shifted away from that in terms of how donors fund. And so I see that as an opportunity and a challenge. There is a muscle there for donors to be doing this kind of work. It was actually how assistance was distributed for quite a long time. But then we just need to be rewired to get back to that muscle. And related with this energy and momentum around localization, I think there is a lot of interest in rebuilding that muscle and in getting back to that. So I see that this only in the grand scheme of time, a few short, decades ago, actually this was how assistance from donors was distributed. And there's a lot of get back to that. And the localization push, I think, can really turn the corner where that's something that we're doing. And I would say though, for challenges, there's just a lot to sort out. So for instance, and Guhad is mentioning things like this, but how do we engage with those who are left out of informal support networks? So as we engage with informal support, we're all acknowledging it, but what exactly does that look like on a day-to-day basis? Certain groups are marginalized, certain people are isolated. What does it look like to engage with informal support networks while lifting up the most marginalized? What does it mean? I sit in a role where I think a lot about coordination across humanitarian and development assistance, but I have a development hat on in my current role. So when it comes to the humanitarian principle of impartiality, aid based on need and need alone, what does that mean for taking informal social safety nets into account? Do we expand what we think about need? What conversations need to happen, and what's the realm of the possible when it comes to maintaining abiding by humanitarian principles? And then, is there something to be said about certain scenarios where this will be more challenging or we don't focus on? So for instance, in my opinion, areas of recurrent and protracted crisis, I think there's an ethical imperative to be taking informal social safety networks into account, because this is often places where we're returning year on year with humanitarian assistance and development assistance in places in crisis. And so that sort of like return assistance, it's so obvious that we need to be taking things into account carefully. If there's an isolated, very fast moving crisis, is there time, or what does it look like? Is there a lighter lift option for taking these into account? Just getting to what makes sense across diverse contexts, and are there certain contexts where it's just so obvious it's a must-have versus others where maybe that's not as much of a priority at first. And then I raised this earlier, but I think, being hyper transparent around targeting and selection criteria is important, it's sufficient, but it does not resolve all conflicts over who deserves what in a crisis context. So for instance, local ideas about need and vulnerability just might differ from external ideas about need and vulnerability. And then there's tensions across groups, especially in a displacement context where a new group arrives, that just can't be resolved by that transparency alone. And so what are the tools that make sense in that context? And the final thing I'll just say, and I share this humbly coming from that donor perspective, is that it's really hard to truly understand social networks. And so, for instance, the concern would be, do we collect data in the spirit of this work but still not do justice? Is it still superficial to the reality of how informal social networks work? I know from my career, I have had moments where I really try to understand the local landscape, local politics, and what's going on, and I get things very wrong. I can remember experiences where I studied social cohesion for years in Southern Africa. It took 5 to 10 years to learn what was actually going on with xenophobic violence attacks and how that was linked to jockeying within the ANC. And there were details to what was going on that even when, as an outsider, you're staring at it, you want to understand what's going on more than anything. You don't get it quite right, or it takes a long time to get it right. So I think, in this conversation, I think there's a question of, how do we get it right, and when can you do more harm than good? I think it would be easy to say, oh, there's 3 questions we can add to a survey now, and we're good, we got it. Now we're taking informal social networks into account, when I think the reality is going to have a lot of nuance. And so figuring out meaningful ways to take these networks into account is, I think it's a thorny challenge. It's a really important one for us to get right and to be thinking about. Over.
Thank you so much, Jessie. We're going to pose the same question to Guhad. This will be our final panel question before we move into the Q&A. So Guhad, the question goes to you. What are some opportunities and challenges that you foresee at the local and community level? Given the looming famine in Somalia, where are there opportunities for aid actors right now to partner with social networks?
Thank you very much. I'll start with the opportunities first. I think the opportunities that the aid actors has in Somalia, there is a large diaspora community that keep on responding to crisis in Somalia. Then the other thing is that the business community or the local business community also is a very vibrant, and there is a vibrant and strong local community that local business actors that can also provide the necessary aid where it is required, as much as they are also part of the social network. And so the opportunity is that they need to, there is that the local institutions are functional as much as they are recurrent droughts and shocks that affect Somalia in one way or the other, be it conflict, drought, floods, and the like, and let's say locust infestation and the like. And there is vibrant diaspora community in Europe, USA, USAID, and the Arab countries, East Africa, and the like. Of course, as Jesse has just mentioned, it is very difficult to put this kind of groups together and then maybe map them out and pull them together. But as aid actor in Somalia, while the drought or the famine is looming now, the most important thing is to work with existing institutions on the ground. For example, in Somalia, the challenge, there are different challenges. Of course, I'll talk about the challenges, but the challenge including inaccessibility to where the people are suffering due to. Being said, then while aid actors are not able to access, there are people who can access. The business community can access, and CSOs can access. I mean, CSOs can access, local NGOs can access, and all those who can access can be used to provide the necessary aid. So the opportunity then is there are local institutions that are capable to deliver aid services to where necessary. I think that is the first thing that they should think about and use it, because we have been crusading about since November last year that where we can't access, where aid actors cannot access, there are people who can access, there are institutions who can access. Let us partner with them and make sure that they are able to serve people in where they are before they go, before they, they work for 2 weeks, 3 weeks to come and access aid in accessible places. Then the other thing is that the local dynamics is also, when you come to the good thing about Somalia, for example, in the Horn of Africa, for example, the societies in the Horn of Africa is structured in clan system. So one of the opportunities that they can use is that instead of grouping, then in between some people are being marginalized, they can use the clan system. Of course, there'll be some resistance, but I think much as there are resistance, there is also opportunity that it can be used to deliver aid. And there are many countries where the clan system has been used. For example, in the Arab countries, the clan system or the shura are the means of entry or the entry point to access the community in terms of aid delivery. So it's one of the things that can be used, that is available for the aid actors. So the thing, what am I saying? I'm saying use the local institutions, use the local structures, and learn from that and empower it so that you are able to deliver it. Now, coming to the challenge, the main challenge is, as I alluded to earlier, is security and access. Because of Al-Shabaab, then access to where the people are or where the crises are, it is very difficult. So local international actors or international actors are not able to access where the people are. They are only able to access where I call the camera area or the dots. For example, where we have all the IDPs or the cities where we are, much of the aid is being delivered are just dots out of the country. So we are moving from Mogadishu to Baidoa, from Mogadishu to Kismayo, to Beledweyne, to Galkayo, to Samareb, and the like. These are dots out of the country if you compare to the entire country. And the other parts of the world or the other parts of the country is controlled by Al-Shabaab. So that is the main challenge, one of the challenges that is blocking aid actors to be able to reach the affected people, especially during this process. And the other challenge that is there in Somalia, for example, for the aid actors, is that because of this security, much of the operations are remote management. So in the remote management, then the humanitarian experts or the expatriates will not be able to know the nuances of their responses, or the challenges, the nitty-gritties of what is happening. They are not able to understand. As Jessie was saying, that she has been, trying to learn the social system of in different parts of the Africa, but she's still unable to cope with. It is this local institution that are able to learn that and to manifest that, how that one works. But if you are, for example, an external actor, and then you are on the other side, or you are in a protected, gated area where you can't have even access to and talk to the people because of your own security, of course, that is very important. Then the much you will understand, or the much you will know in terms of local dynamics, will be very small, if any. So that is another challenge. The other challenge that aid actors have to cope with is, in Somalia, for example, or in the Horn of Africa entirely, there is high level of marginalization and exclusion and inclusion errors, where minorities and marginalized clans or tribes are always on the peripheries of aid and are not included in the aid benefit, are not benefiting from aid benefits, and they are not included. And as such, then the gap between the dominant and minorities always continue increasing. So this is one of the challenges that they have to cope with and try to think how to address. So the biggest gap between affected population and aid actors is the power brokers, which are now the local authorities, the local authorities, gatekeepers, and including the very important and most critical gatekeeper, humanitarian or aid actors staff on the ground. So all these are challenges, and aid actors need to be prepared to face these challenges and look into it amicably, even if most of these things will not be solved within a short time. But these are things that we have to live with, we are living with, and we have to try means of addressing them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you, Guhad and Jessie, for your very, very thoughtful answers to these questions during our panel. I'm happy to transition us to our Q&A. As I mentioned, many wonderful questions have come in, and these will be questions for Guhad, Jessie, and Maha to respond to. So the first question will be for Guhad, then Jessie. And here's the question. Why don't humanitarian agencies enhance the beneficiary selection process to make it more transparent? Similarly, why do donors and implementing agencies not develop transparent feedback mechanisms? Guhad, what's your take on that? And let's try to keep our responses brief so that we can get to as many questions as we can. Over to you, Guhad.
Thank you very much. And this is a very handy question for this session. And given the current crisis in Somalia and the Horn of Africa at large, and aid actors, when they write their proposals and grant proposal to the donors, they use sophisticated or high-tech consultants or high-tech professionals who don't have local context to win the proposal, to win the grant. I think Jessie will concur with me, because I assume you always sit on the other side of the table, where the other side, the donor side of the table. So when they use that and they don't have the local context, they will use a high-tech standard beneficiary selection criteria. Of course, what works in Somalia might not work in Nigeria. What works in Saudi Arabia might not work in South Africa in terms of beneficiary selection. So because of the different dynamics, so that is one of the challenges that the aid actors, when they are putting their proposals together, and the donor on the other side will look at this nice and technical proposal and become happy with it and fund it. But the point is, and when you take those beneficiary selection criteria, sometimes it might not even work. It is not bottom up, it is top down. And it was in the proposal, it was approved and agreed, then it might be very difficult for them to change. And if they have to change, they have to come back to the donor and convince the donor why they have to change. And you know the bureaucracy and around the changing such kind of proposals, such kind of important component of the proposal. So they avoid, and they always, or aid actors always go for the easy things and want to remain in the comfort zone. That is the problem of beneficiary selection criteria. If the beneficiary selection criteria were not in the proposal, for example, the grant is there and the aid actor got the grant, they go to the ground, talk to the people on the ground, and ask what is the beneficiary selection criteria. And then it becomes bottom up, then that will have even be different, might be better than what they have proposed, for example. That is one of the challenges with the aid actors in terms of putting their beneficiary selection criteria before they go to the ground. From the donor perspective, I think the reluctance is from the donor perspective, from the donor side. Because if the prescription comes from the donor side, aid agencies will have followed that, even if they have different policies. We have experimented that, and that one is a matter of fact, that if a donor said, I want the following procedures to be followed, then the donor will come for them, the aid actor will come for the money and implement those specific points that the donor wants. So what is refusing what is not marrying the other is that either of the two are seated on their comfort zones. And maybe Jesse will agree with me that donors in their offices will receive a certain envelope of money, and they have to spend that money within a certain period of time. And their big challenge is to dispatch that money and commit that money than maybe looking into some nuances of the implementation. Of course, the nuances of the implementation are very important, but sometimes when you have a lot of money not committed or to spend, and the time is there, then you might be forced to push that money out. And that has been happening, maybe not all over the world, but this part of the world. That is one of the things that we have been seeing. So what I could say in terms of conclusion is that I think the best thing is that beneficiary selection criteria should be bottom up, not top down. Even if the aid actors are writing good proposals, I think their staff on the ground should be used to generate the local context in terms of beneficiary selection. And for the donors, I think the best thing is that they should also localize, they should also push for localized beneficiary selection criteria. I don't know if I have confused, but let me stop there.
No, thank you so much, very much, God, for that response. Jesse, I'm wondering what you would add or any other perspectives you'd share on that question.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple quick points that focus a bit more on communication. So I do think two things that come up commonly in the field. One is an aid actor might think they explained the selection criteria, but it just didn't think it. I think over communicating that a hyper transparent selection process means coming back to this over and over again, because the way in which one person gets a handful of money and another person doesn't, that's really consequential. An aid actor might be busy with their day, their bureaucracy, a million tasks, and they think they communicated this selection criteria. But if you're on the other side and it makes the difference, there's some rule that makes the difference between whether you get a pile of money or not, that's so consequential in that local context, that's so meaningful. And so flipping that worldview to appreciate, no, this is actually one of the most important things you need to be messaging in this space. I think that from a communication perspective matters. And then whether it's humanitarian assistance or development assistance, it's very possible that what that criteria is doesn't really make sense. So it might not be internalized in the same way because it's a quirky bureaucratic thing, like, well, did households get this and this, you know? So with humanitarian assistance, there might be rules around impartiality and who gets what. And then with development assistance, there might be other kinds of standards for targeting that just are not meaningful in the local context. So even when someone says that, it's kind of like, well, I know they have access to this and this, and it just doesn't resonate or it's not meaningful. So yeah, I would just, you know, build on Guhad's comments, which some of the like language translation and communication side to it, and where I think maybe folks get it wrong, even when they thought they did it or something.
Thanks a lot, Jessie. I appreciate that. All right, Jessie, the next question is going to be for you, and then Maha and Guhad. The question is, the research offers recommendations, but operationalizing these recommendations is a challenge. Can the presenters share opportunities they see, especially given localization that could integrate and leverage informal networks instead of modifying traditional, quote unquote, traditional approaches? So Jessie, what's your take on that? And let's try to keep our responses succinct as best we can.
I don't know if this is what the person is thinking about, and I'd go to Maha for this, but there's certain award options that can just enable more informal groups. So for instance, grants under contract is one option. And just otherwise, there are award options to be funding, you know, informal groups, smaller groups, in ways that don't then put the burden of managing USAID assistance on that informal group in a way that just doesn't make sense. That group should be doing what their real goal is, which is something meaningful in their community and not, you know, HR and bureaucracy and things like that. So I would just point to, in terms of supporting those groups, there's certain mechanisms like grants under contract that would allow us to fund informal initiatives, and they already do, but scaling it up, you know, so these things all exist. There's a lot of cool tools out there. The question is just, what piece of the pie is it in terms of how donors give out assistance? So leveraging those cool approaches and just scaling them up, seeing what's the realm of the possible. And for instance, grants under contract is one option. I know a lot of other options do put an administrative burden on those informal groups in a way that's not helpful for the cause, for the social goal that they have where they are. And so avoiding that and finding ways to fund good work, but to avoid that burden is super key.
Thanks, Jessie. Guhad, do you have anything you'd like to add around this question?
Well, I think what I will add is that informal groups are important part of a rural economy, and as much as they are important part of rural economy, and I agree with Jessie that the trend that we have been seeing, most of the large or the bigger donors don't want to fund directly because they think that these small groups or these small social groups might not be able to meet the criteria, or might not have the skills or the capacity, or maybe putting a lot of burden on them is another challenge. But I think one thing that could be done or will have been done is that maybe working with other interlocutors, intermediary or groups like other NGOs or international NGOs and the like. But coming to the question, normally the research, what I don't know if it is all over, but one thing I have seen in Somalia is that day in, day out, or year in, year out, we do research and provide a lot of recommendations. And the challenge is that not even half of the recommendations are picked and used by aid actors or even the donors sometimes, unless maybe a donor has funded a certain research and they want to implement that research through their partners or those that they are funding, which is common. But for example, if I do a research and then I present to the donors and they accept it, not all of them will take. That is a big challenge all over there. But I think the most important thing is that yes, challenges are there, but the most important thing is trying to work with what is available. And of course, the smaller social groups have been getting support from the donors, and most of the donors, for example, I know more than 250 VSLA groups in Somalia, and were it not the donors, they will not have been there. So it is only that there are a lot of expectations, and maybe the affected people or people on the ground want to run before they walk, but the donors are doing a lot, yes. But the thing is, how do you connect the dots? Which, of course, I might be able to talk on behalf of Somalia, because I've been working in Somalia for quite some times, and my assumption is that the problem of not being able to connect the dots is because of lack of functional or performing government in Somalia, and maybe in other countries where such a governments are operational, maybe such things are different. So I think that is different in different contexts, but yeah, a lot of things are happening. Over.
Thank you so much, Guhad. Maha, any quick notes you'd like to add before we go to our next question?
Sure, happy to. So I think I'd start off by saying that we already do some work that supports informal support networks, whether or not that is an intentional or primary outcome or a secondary outcome. And so, for example, there's self-help groups, savings groups, VSLAs, village and savings loan associations, too many acronyms. But these, as some of the research has shown, all foster important components that inform social connectedness and social solidarity and social support. So we are already doing that to some degree, and the next step would then be more intentional and folding in questions about social connectedness and informal support into evaluations that occur at various stages. And then the second, I would also point to this approach developed by Local to Global, which is called the Survivor and Community-Led Response Approach, so the SCLR. And it was an approach that was developed to support and resource individuals and communities that are affected by sudden or protracted crises. And it's the idea is to help communities and to support communities' aspirations to build on and support these spontaneously organized self-help actions. And these are opportunities, and opportunities like this and other locally led initiatives really offer a lot of promise when it comes to allowing communities or empowering communities to solve problems on their own terms and working with them as partners rather than as beneficiaries.
Thank you, Maha. The next question is for you as well. If the local institutions are clan-based and therefore working through local institutions perpetuates exclusion of other clans, or localization perpetuates other institutionalized marginalization, how can donors find out about the excluded people?
Another great question, and I can't speak to the clan-based aspects. Guhad probably can speak to that a lot better than me, but I think first and foremost, it means focusing on how to on finding out how to identify marginalized populations, while also empowering and holding community committees accountable at the same time. So it's quite a balance that you have to strike. But really, local actors are the ones who have the best sense of who is excluded from these systems. They understand the sources and the factors that compound marginalization, and these local actors can help guide and assist us in the process of identifying excluded and vulnerable populations. Go ahead, I don't know if you want to add to the point on the clan-based exclusion.
Yes, I think, yes, local institutions are also part of the marginalization. And for example, in a situation where the entire system is more of clan-based, the societal structure or the community structure is clan-based, and each clan or each member of the clan is just fighting for his or her clan, then the most important thing is that how much can we make our response or our humanitarian response or the system of informal social network building be inclusive. When we look from the inclusivity perspective, Of course, then it is important, as I mentioned earlier, to understand in your operational area, for example, who is dominant there and who is minority there and who is marginalized there, and what are the implications of humanitarian response or development interventions. So it is important to understand who is living where or who is dominating who there in that particular area. For example, experience or from our past experience is that it happens that in most cases, the local authority comes from the dominant clans or the dominant tribes. Then the NGO staff or humanitarian actors staff on the ground come from the same clans. Then the business community or the large influential people come from the same clan. Then when you call people to discuss, sit on the table and discuss the humanitarian or social network development, then you are talking to the same people and you left out some others. Of course, for international actors, it will be very difficult. But the thing is that, as I mentioned earlier again, not all institutions think the same. When you work with the CSOs and yours, of course, some of them will tell you that this is this and this is this clan and these are left out, this and these ones have been left out, and this one have been included, and that is where inclusion exclusion errors come in. So the most important thing is understanding who's there and what are the implications in terms of intervention planning. Once you understand that, I think you'll be able to challenge or manage the local initiatives to marginalize the other locals. Over.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that response. Jesse, this question is for you. For humanitarians and urgent work, when we collect more and different data, we often need to remove some other questions or focus on other pieces of information. If we're going to bake new questions or focus areas in, what should we not focus on or remove?
That's such a good question. And I think I'll actually relate it to the last conversation we were just having. And so in short, what I would say is that, yes, there's limited time maybe in a humanitarian survey, and there's probably just some core brass tacks that are essential to be collecting. To me, what would be ideal is that there are other kinds of actors, development actors who are also in that same geography. So this is especially relevant for a recurrent and protracted crisis context where we have both kinds of assistance. To me, what would be ideal, and this is work that Mercy Corps has pioneered, you would have something like crisis analytics that humanitarians and development folks alike can benefit from. So maybe there is a core survey that humanitarians are doing that gets at those brass tacks. But then with something like crisis analytics, this iterative data, you can have that deeper dive into these aspects about informal social protection, about other things that help think about those medium development goals that we're interested in, other kinds of well-being, but beyond that life-saving and reducing suffering sort of stage of humanity. And in areas of recurrent protracted crisis, you will be in the same geography. There will be these geographies where a variety of actors are there, and analytics like that can be, and everyone doesn't have to collect that. If you're in the same geographies, in the same wards, et cetera, then ideally there could be a consortium or something where that information is being shared. So I think that's just really promising. And it makes me think about the question of, well, how do we get at these clan dynamics and what does that look like in a humanitarian survey? In my opinion, we would be thinking about comparative advantage. And for instance, something like that crisis analytics would have those political economy kind of questions in it where you would be getting at some of those issues. And a question I guess I have is, how far down do these things go? So for instance, to the clan question, outsiders might come to understand that Bantu people are marginalized. They might not come to understand what sub-clan. I think when we get into these informal social protection, questions, I think there is a question of what level of detail and nuance leads to more impactful aid versus what, I saw this come up in the chat, what essentially requires an ethnography in every single geography that even a local institution might not understand, right? Because even if a local institution is in a particular district, et cetera, they just might not know these community level dynamics that maybe are impactful about things like, how like the debt cycle in a community, a lot of unique features. So I think that's an open question and something to be discussing together. But yeah, those are my quick thoughts on how to triage time in the humanitarian survey. It's to avoid the question and have someone else do another survey in the same geography.
Thank you so much. Well, we have just a few more minutes left, so we're going to do a lightning round. We've got one question, and we'd love to hear from each of you in just 1 minute. And we know that there are other questions that have been posed that have not been answered, but my colleagues will talk more about that in a moment, how we're going to deal with those. So here's the question. While humanitarians always work hard to include the perspective of the local communities, consult with marginalized communities, etc., this is something that the aid community has heard and worked on for years. So why are we still hearing that it's not happening? Seems that knowing it is important and trying to do it is not enough. What do the aid agencies say are the key blocks, and what are the suggestions to overcome them? Localization has been a goal for years too, and again, if it's not happening, why? So lightning round, Jesse, what's your response?
Oh my gosh, it's such a good question. I would say it's because while we have been preaching about localization or, again, since the 70s, participatory rural appraisals to a local ownership agenda to localization now, we have been saying about the same thing for nearly 50 years. But at the same time, those forces I was talking about earlier, the professionalization of the sector, their intention and professionalization wins out because there are incentives to keep Congress happy, to ensure that we are accountable for what we're doing and to avoid the risk of that kind of crisis of legitimacy that comes when things go quite badly. And so that tension has always been there. And so having the rubber hit the road on localization is a journey, but at some point, what is more meaningful and legitimate is to actually do localization. Like at some point we get so far towards, we've over professionalized. What does it mean to actually be legitimate actors who it makes sense for us to intervene in the world? Localization is ultimately the answer to that. So I think we have rounded the bend. What you need is different stakeholders to agree, whether that's Congress, whether that's other key actors to say, yeah, a localization agenda is the direction we're moving, other donors, et cetera, and to get some clear commitments out there that we're actually marching towards. So this has been thick with rhetoric for a very long time and thinner on targets and very clear action steps. Or there are action steps like under Raj Shah, where it's too high, too quick, and you can't do it, so then you fail. So what does that mean? So anyway, that's my quick answer. Over to Guhad.
Yes, Guhad, thank you, Jesse. Okay, Guhad, 1 minute, and then over to Maha for her response in closing.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I have understood the question very well, but just to try and follow Jesse. And I think my take on this is that as much as both donors and international aid actors have been trying hard in the last several years to push for high level of inclusivity and try to work out and see that how they get rid of marginalization, I think the blame is on three-sided. One, the local communities who, in their positions, for example, think that when the societal structures is more of clan-based or tribal-based, then that constituency, pushing everything for that constituency, is one challenge from the local communities. From the aid access community and including donors and the actors themselves, is as much as they want to go out and they want to see that improved on papers, making sure that they get into the nitty-gritties of that, into the hand, and putting the hands into the mud and challenging the status quo and pushing for the realities that are on the paper to be practical, is very limited. And we often want to remain on the comfort zone of not getting into problems, because, for example, if we say, no, this clan X is minority here and clan Y is majority here, this one is dominant, we have to push in, and then, what are you saying? Are you talking about, are you bringing clanism here? And then the local authority says that, and then we become frustrated, we're fearful, and then we become skeptical of that kind of things. And then, okay, let's just keep it like that. And then we keep on reporting, but the reality is that we are not ready to challenge and put our hands into the mud and change it. I think that is the best way to do, and that is what is missing. Over.
Okay, Maha, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Samantha. I think just in response to that last question, I would just like to mention that, like, for a long time, there has been the false impression that this takes time and resources that we don't have. But as the research has shown, these informal support networks are incredibly efficient, and they respond far more quickly than most aid actors or most formal aid actors can. And this is going to be increasingly important in the context of compounding crises, including climate change, conflict, and the recent COVID-19 pandemic. But as I wrap things up today, I just really wanted to quickly pivot to localization. So as today's discussion has highlighted, communities are their own first responders. Yet many of the conversations regarding localization have focused on INGOs partnering with local NGO counterparts and have left out informal support networks and community actors from conversations regarding the localization process. So we recognize the bureaucratic and operational challenges that come with partnering with informal support networks. But with aid actors increasingly forced to do with more with less, the cost of not working through these networks is too high, given the unprecedented scale of need and the limited resources with which to respond. These informal support networks are a vital resilience capacity, and the time is ripe to intentionally design programs with them in mind. I want to thank all of you who have joined us today, as well as our panelists, for making the time to share their thoughts and experiences with us. And we also welcome your thoughts and feedback. If you have any questions or further reflections to share, please reach out to our event coordinators, who will pass them along to us.